but I'm also moderating. So I am an economist, and I felt that I learned qualitative methods and mixed methods from the panelists. So I offer myself to moderate the discussion since I feel like the rookie here. So we'll get it started. And I think we have some slides. I don't know if you want to show the slides so that people can get familiar to our approach to the panel today. So that I'm going to let our speakers to introduce themselves and their expertise on this area. Right, I think the plan is to have some discussion. I'll try to moderate. These conversations, these seminars are very informal in the sense that I feel that if people have a pressing question and want to jump in, we're always welcome to do that. As you can see here, we'll kind of spend around 45 minutes answering 4 questions with our expert panel. Then we're going to have a follow-up question. But again, I feel like if in the middle of the conversation someone wants us to elaborate on something else, of course, we're always open to that. And we have a PowerPoint slide that is going to guide us in the discussion. And then these slides will be available to you too as well after we post the session. It will be recorded and it will be available as a resource. Okay, so I think let me get it started. I know the first question is to get our panelists to introduce themselves. So I think that's probably the next slide, correct?
There we go.
Okay, so yeah, we can use this slide. So I think we can start a conversation. I already shared a little bit about myself, and I'm gonna let our next panelist. So we'll go kind of like in the order of the picture. As an economist, I learned, how to do qualitative research from the panelists here. I remember one of my colleagues from the economics field, when I started doing qualitative research, he's like, do you really want to do that? And then I'm like, of course, because a lot of the questions I had, big data sets or surveys, weren't able to answer those questions. And I'm very happy that through RCMAR CHIME, I got the training. And I'm hoping that today, you get a taste and tips and useful knowledge that you can build on. So I'm going to let Homero and then Ron and Gary to provide their expertise and their experience, and then we can move forward. So Homero, please get us started introducing yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Homero Deltino. My training is actually in philosophy, and I am an associate professor at Charles Street University of Medicine and Science, adjunct associate professor here at the David Geffen School of Medicine, and also a research health scientist at the VA. That's it. I'm also an alumni of RCMAR Scientists. As I mentioned, my background was in philosophy. When I got my first pilot project through CHIME, it was a qualitative project. And so, although I'm now here on this panel, I see myself as someone who's still learning. So I was never an anointed expert, but I feel it's kind of been snowballing, accumulating knowledge on how to, I guess it's deepening my understanding of how to do qualitative and bringing quantitative and do mixed methods and all that good stuff. So I'm looking forward to the questions more than hearing myself talk.
Thank you, Homero. And then we can go with Ron.
Okay, can I get clarification? Are we still going to have the first question be about how we've applied mixed methods, or is
yeah? Let's just do quick introductions and then we can do the mixed method discussion.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I'm professor in the Department of Medicine, Division of General and Internal Medicine, the same thing that Carol and Kenrick are in, and also adjunct researcher at RAND. And I started at RAND in 1984 full-time, then went full-time to UCLA in 1997. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and then I'll go Gary.
All right, I'm Gary Ryan. I'm an anthropologist by training. I was trained as a methodologist, both on the qual side and the quant side, and ended up spending many years, close to 20 at RAND, being on all sorts of research projects. Eventually, I have moved the last 5 years ago. I moved to the Kaiser Permanente's new medical school in Pasadena. And like all of you, I am still learning how to do this and talk about it. It's a rolling process of understanding these methodological pieces. And you basically have learned by doing, as Ron and I figured out over many years.
Well, thank you for the introduction. So I think in the next slide, I think we have some questions, right, Ron?
Yeah, it should be one of the, keep going. Yeah, there, well, no, next one. Yeah, there it is.
Okay, perfect. So I think it's a good way to kind of jump in. So we can chat here about, how do we apply mixed methods in our research, and maybe we can provide some examples that can be useful for the audience. So Mero, you want to get started here? We have a list.
Sure. So just the first question, correct?
Yes.
Correct. Yeah, just the first question. Yeah.
Okay. So how have I applied mixed methods in my research? So doing social science research was new to me. And I guess the way I approached it was, as I mentioned earlier, my first project was qualitative. And pretty much my mentor said to me, qualitative is one way to approach things, but then you need the quantitative piece to kind of give you real information. There was this sort of like quantitative bias that folks have, that they have against qualitative. But I guess what I've learned since then, that was like over 10 years ago, was that at the end of the day, as we were talking about earlier, it's like, what is your research question? And what's going to help you figure out how to answer it, right? So I've recently, I'm currently completing a randomized control trial of an intervention to promote PrEP to Latino gay men with their siblings. But that project started 5 years ago, and it started with qualitative and quantitative, right? We needed to talk to siblings, we needed to understand what they knew, what they didn't know, we needed to talk to the Latino gay men. And it was really much just kind of back and forth between qualitative and quantitative, looking what they said in the surveys, then taking those answers from the surveys and showing them to the siblings and see what the siblings thought about the surveys, and then kind of retweaking the surveys and just going this sort of back and forth. So in my experience, to answer the question, how have I applied mixed methods? I've always seen it as a way to sort of, I know the fancy word is triangulate, but I always think of it as kind of bouncing the research question back and forth between two approaches, right? To kind of get very clear on what it is that you want to know.
Thanks, Omero. And I think it was such a good example to talk about how your qualitative research really built into the RCT that you're working on, and how it really helped you to explore at the beginning. So I'll share briefly about my experience, right? As an economist, I'm very interested in the financial well-being of older adults. And I guess his disparities that we see, right? Racial, ethnic, and gender disparities. And what I noticed, I started working with the HRS data for my RCMAR CHIME project, right? I was a scientist myself too, like Omero. And I found in the HRS that a lot of older adults, Hispanics and African Americans, are less likely to have a bank account, right? But if I wanted to understand the reasons why, the HRS couldn't provide that to me at all, the Health and Retirement Studies survey, right? So it was very nice how through RCMAR CHIME, they proposed me, well, Luisa, your question is very important, right? But you should do qualitative research can help, right? And that's how I got started, because I was like, yeah. And then I learned how to do qualitative research through RCMAR CHIME. And I felt that it really opened the door. Like at the School of Public Policy in Pepperdine, I teach a capstone for the students who are about to graduate, right? And for example, they have very, I guess some of them have novel questions, right? On like, for example, I had one student working on carbon sequestration, right? And then, of course, there is not that much secondary data set out there, right? So if I want him to do an econometric analysis, he's not gonna get too far. But with qualitative research, he was able to conduct expert interviews and found very interesting policy implications, right? So I think, qualitative and quantitative research can really complement each other, especially for some research questions, right? And I think we can move forward with Ron to share also how he applies mixed methods too.
Okay, I'll quickly say, so I started at RAND 40 years ago, and it was the medical outcome study, and that's where the SF-36 was developed. And at that time, qualitative methods were not used very much in developing surveys. So most of my work has been in developing and evaluating surveys, but we didn't do anything qualitative. All we did was pre-testing. We, drafted items and then we pre-tested them, and then we decided we revised them and then did applied them in a study, medical outcome study. But 30 years ago, so 10 years after that, I think it started becoming more and more common that you had to do qualitative work up front. And that qualitative work is focus groups, cognitive interviews, and sometimes in-depth interviews. So Carol Mangione led a study 30 years ago on the National Eye Institute Visual Function Questionnaire that had about 52 focus groups. It's one of the largest number of focus groups ever done for survey development. And then the Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Providers and Systems CAPS project came along, and it was routine to do focus groups, cognitive interviews, and then do your large-scale field testing. And then Catherine Sarkissian, I think it was a little bit after that, developed her expectations about aging scale, and that had in-depth interviews and focus groups. And so more recently, it took about 16 years ago, it's still been a long time ago, but more recently, the FDA has got involved with guidance documents for survey development. And once they got involved, they really make it mandatory for people to be doing qualitative data collection before you go ahead with large-scale field testing. So over time, it's increased more and more the importance of doing the combination. But all the work I've done has been kind of a sequence where you start with qualitative and then you go to more quantitative data collection. And then if you're lucky, you might go back to qualitative. But I know there's all kinds of other ways you can do it and actually report both together. And Gary is the real expert on the qualitative stuff as well as being, very competent in everything else. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Ron. But I think, these examples are really good one, right? Where we really use qualitative research for measurement development, right? We want to create measures that are able to capture in a good way, in an appropriate, valid way, right? So then it's very important to think about qualitative work. So then we move with Gary. So Gary, please share. I feel like I took your classes on qualitative methods. I consult with you all the time. So it will be very good to hear from you too.
All right. So sort of following on all of you three, Ron's right. It's this mix of going back and forth, but I guess I look at it as less about the qualitative and quantitative data and more about what are the questions you're asking. And it really seems to me that what we're asking is a mix of exploratory and confirmatory. So let me explain what I see as the difference. So exploratory is when you ask, I want to understand, and you fill it up with the W questions, what, where, when, and why, and who, or you fill it up with how. So I want to understand how, for example. That's an exploratory question. It's before you have hunches and hypotheses, or you want to know something very specific. The next set of questions, the confirmatory questions, are you testing an idea? Is this true or not? Is this model true or not? That's a test. And then you're asking the question, it's not about understand, you're asking, do I know if this is true? Or do I know how much, how many, how often? I need a number, and I need to be really confident about that number. All right, so to me, that's really what you're doing when you're mixing the methods, is because you have to have a different strategy for each of those types of questions. And so sometimes, like Ron says, early on, you start with the exploratory. What do we need to ask in this survey? And then you go to the confirmatory is, well, I need an instrument that is going to systematically count and allow me to count how often something occurs. And so you go exploratory to confirmatory. In other cases, what you do is I have this data set and I test something out and I say, oh, what is there disparities? And I want to know yes or no. Well, I got to have a way of testing that. So I take the data set, I run a whole bunch of statistical analysis on it, and I go, thumbs up, yes. And then the question becomes, so why? How do I understand why this disparity is occurring? And now I'm back into that exploratory mode. What are the mechanisms behind this? And I'm going often to interviews, or I'm doing focus groups, or I'm getting insights into a complex system. So to me, it's moving back and forth between questions and strategies. And it just so happens that a lot of your exploration is going to generate qualitative information because you don't know what the hell is there. You got to ask what is going on before you can actually start counting it. So you end up exploratory is highly associated, and the code word is qualitative, and confirmatory, because I need systematic data to count things or test a hypothesis, it tends to be quantitative. But I can explore with quantitative. In many ways, factor analysis or multidimensional scaling is an exploratory analysis using numbers, right? You feed it in, you get pattern recognition. So I just look at it as, what's your strategy? What's your question and what's the strategy to answer it? Now, there are occasions where we have one question, we actually use different techniques to answer the same question, right? So in quantitative analysis, you might have one data set, one question, and you use 3 different statistical analyses to actually ask the same question in 3 different ways and try to answer it that way. That to me is mixed method, but it's mixed in the sense you're using multiple techniques that all happen to be quantitative, right? And likewise, when you do on the exploratory side, you might say, well, for this group, I want to use individual interviews to ask what is going on with this program. And then for another set of groups, I might use focus groups. Those are mixed methods, interviews, semi-structured interviews and focus groups to get at what is there, how does it work? They have different advantages and disadvantages. And so I get a better view and a better, more robust answer to my question using different techniques. So that's how I basically define it. For what it's worth.
Gary, sometimes it's referred to inductive and deductive, right?
Another set of phrases, exactly, right? Is you're testing, it's deductive. And when you don't know what the heck is going on, that's inductive.
Okay, yeah, no, I think, what you are mentioning here about confirmatory and exploratory is very important to keep in mind, and as Ron gave the more technical terms for that, right? So I think it will flow well if perhaps we move into the opportunities and then we'll talk about the challenges, right? So I think maybe if the panelists can share, like, what do they think is one of the opportunities, right, of mixed methods? I mean, it might kind of piggyback on what you already shared. And then we can move more into, the practical challenges that we all face when we conduct qualitative research. So we can continue following the same order, or if someone, or I can mix it up. So I guess we can start the opposite. So we'll start with Gary, just to mix it up a little. So just talk about the opportunities, like you see, kind of like piggyback writing on some of the things you say, 1 or 2 opportunities that you see from mixed methods approach.
If you're gonna, I think, if you're going to try to understand how systems work or how you can improve them, you're going to have to start in some ways with one of those 2 approaches. Oftentimes we need a description of how does the system work to begin with. That's going to be qualitative. That's going to be exploratory. How does it work, right? You're going to ask people questions, and essentially what you're going to do, the opportunity here is to ask people to use their eyeballs to tell you different perspectives on this thing called a system. Because almost no one actually understands a complete system because they're always part of it. So you need eyeballs. So you start off with exploratory. And then what you do is you go, I need to know not only how does it work, but how do either I need to know numerically, what do the flows look like? I need numbers to understand flows and priority areas. So then you might do a survey, or you might go into like an EHR to follow and trace people through different treatment patterns in a clinic, for example, right? And now you need quantitative data to understand those flows, because you can't pick that up with just asking people how it works. You need more precision. And so I can see that way as a way to explore. Alternatively, you can flip it around and say, well, let's use the EHR data to identify which clinics are doing well or poorly. And then you use it as a targeting mechanism. So you go quantitative first, target, so that you can better explore to understand the similarities and differences. But you to me, you can't do systems and understand how systems work or figure out how to manipulate them and fix them unless you use both. And our challenge is most of us we adapt and we get familiar with one side of the equation and we treat the other as it's inferior to whatever we do. And you need a team usually to actually be able to see both sides. So I think that's where your opportunities are.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that. So I guess, Ron, what is one of the major opportunities? And here we can agree, disagree is fine too, right? So, so what are some of
Yeah,
the
I think mine is obvious that any survey development now is a perfect opportunity. You have to use mixed methods. You're not going to get it published or recognized. So that's one thing. But one specific thing that's a little bit new versus the sequence that I talked about, usually qualitative or inductive precedes the deductive or the confirmatory in survey development. But like in CAPS, one example is we found in some, it could be anywhere, but in pediatric hospitalizations, when people report on fixed closed-ended questions, and you compare that with one question at the end that says, is there anything else you want to tell us? And then you code that open-ended data, you find that you explain unique information and overall ratings with the coded qualitative data. So it sort of supplements what you get in closed. You don't get full information in closed-ended data. So together, you're getting a fuller picture of what people's experience with care is. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Ron. So I'll share briefly some of the opportunities I see for myself as an economist, right? I feel like qualitative research really opened the door to me to really understand human behavior to a different level, right? And I work in the space of randomized control trials with digital interventions for behavioral change in the space of health and personal finances, right? And I see a lot of opportunities here, right? Especially if we are designing, an intervention, we really need to understand, what is the things that people want to learn, right? Or what are the message that is really gonna nudge people to change, right? And I think, qualitative research is crucial to really be able to design an intervention that is really gonna meet the needs of your target population. So for me, that's one key opportunity that I see, right? That and then exploring, right? So I feel like qualitative research is really helping you to understand, things that have come up and no one knows, right? For example, during COVID-19, we did some focus groups with Latino parents to learn more about, what are the things that are making them hesitant to vaccinate their children, right? And it was something kind of like just developing, right? The vaccine was going to become available pretty soon, and we wanted to learn, how do we help them, right, to make that difficult decision, and what is the misinformation out there, and it was very insightful. I feel we learned so much that we couldn't, qualitative research was a way to go for us to really understand and create a curricula that can meet the needs of our community. So I'll move, Mero, so what will be one of the opportunities or that you see for mixed methods?
So I take a slightly different approach. Like when I think about mixed methods, I think about also, let's see, like from a standpoint of epistemology, if you will, like what is the knowledge that's being created and what is being produced? And I think that with mixed methods, you get to produce knowledge that you cannot get with only one of those methods. And so I'll give you two examples, right? And I think what I've done, rightly or wrongly, is just try to weave them into each other, right? So you can weave some of your qualitative finding, your quantitative into your qualitative, and it'll change the kind of answers you get. Right. So for example, when I did one of my first studies with older Latino gay men in family support for sobriety, right? They were in recovery for alcohol use disorders. Remember, I used the a social support scale, and I think one of the questions was something like, "There is someone who can take me to the doctor right now if I need it." And the person said no, or disagreed or something like that. And then we were having a conversation, right? And so I reviewed the surveys, we jumped into the interview, and while we're having a conversation, he said, oh, I have so much strong social support, people will drop everything they're doing, on the second to come and help me if I need it. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting because, flip back to my pages. Here, you just said to us that there's no one available to take you to the doctor. So right now, you're telling me if something happened to you, no one can take you to the doctor. That's what your survey is telling me, but you're telling me, that there's someone that's always available to take you somewhere, right? And so I'll never forget, he said, oh, well, they're working right now. Of course, I won't ask them, right? So no one's available right now at this time of day, but if I really needed it, right? So it just helped me see how his understanding of the survey was just a little off. And if I had just stuck to that, I would have said this person has no social support. If I had just stuck to the qualitative question, like, do you have social support, right? Or tell me about your social support, it would have, I would have said, oh, he has amazing social support. As opposed to, no, there's something more in the middle, something a little more nuanced, right? So there's ways, I think, that they can inform each other. And again, I know that sounds very generic, but I think of them also as like twigs, right? You kind of run them together to start a fire. You can't privilege one twig over the other, right? So that's what I mean. Like, what is the knowledge that gets produced when you are using two different methods? And it all depends on what do you want to know, right? And so, like, for the randomized control trial, again, we're asking people about their sexual risk behaviors. So I do look at their surveys to find out when was the last time they had condom in the sex? Are they using drugs when they do this, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And I can use those questions, I can use their answers from the surveys to sort of guide how I ask the questions or bring up the issues, right? Because I interview folks with their sibling present. So sometimes they might give this answer like, they don't do anything, they're holy, they're saving themselves for marriage, right? But I know that's not true from the survey, so that I can just say, oh, so, any parties you've been to in the last 2 weeks or in the last 30 days, any substance use, right? I just feel like it helps open up the qualitative in a way that wouldn't happen naturally just with the qualitative questions alone, right? So I guess in that regard, again, to go back to how I started this, I think of this as from an epistemological perspective, right? Like, what's the knowledge you're trying to produce? And relying on one over the other, right? Or privileging one over the other, I think isn't always the best way to go or the best conversation to have either, right? Like, if you're going to do mix, you need to rub them together, right? To get a fire started. That's how I see this as well.
Thank you for sharing a very good example. So I think, now we want to talk about the challenges.
Yeah.
I think
Listen, hang on just a minute. One of the things that's on there is what are the challenges? And we didn't really talk about some of the challenges. And I would argue.
Exactly. I want to jump into that. So
okay, go back to okay, good.
Yeah, exactly. We're moving. Yeah, I kind of moved a little bit to the opportunity because that's how we started.
Yeah.
So I want us to talk about the challenges. So I think, here it will be good for us to share one or two main challenges that we have faced when we conduct qualitative research methods, right? Or mixed methods. So I will let, I guess I will let the speakers kind of jump in. How about that? We'll make it more fluid now. So anyone has a pressing need to say the challenges? I have a lot of challenges, I have to say. Yeah. It hasn't been an easy road for me, but I'll let our panelists to get it started.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Gary. I knew you had something.
I was going to say, I think there's challenges of your own expertise, but what I find the biggest challenge for me is when I'm trying to help people, it's the stupid jargon. There's way too much jargon across the different techniques. And so everybody gets confused about what you're actually doing. And so I've been just basically saying, stop using the jargon, because if you use qualitative jargon, the quantitative people are not going to understand it. And the qualitative people, whatever jargon you use, there's going to be somebody going, well, what specific type are you going to use? So you get hammered from both sides. So what I would argue is, if you're going to have different questions, just simply describe in real words what you plan to do, what you plan to collect, and how you plan to analyze something, so that, your colleagues that might not be experts in any of this would sit there and head bob. So just be pragmatic.
Gary, somebody wants to know what jargon, for example.
grounded theory, for example, right? Or IRT, or right, all these things that you're demonstrating your expertise on the exploratory or the confirmatory side is you're signaling, I know what I'm talking about. It's laden with specific techniques that are usually 2 to 3 words long in the phrase, right? So if you're going to tell, what's the focus group? Well, what are you going to do in the focus group? Give people an idea. Or how is that different than a semi-structured interview? Give people sort of an idea what you're going to ask. That goes a lot further. And if you constantly tie your technique back to what you're trying to get at, then everybody will head bob, yeah, that makes sense as a strategy.
Thank
Okay.
you. Good examples, Gary.
So I'll give another example. Well, it's sort of what Gary said, communication is a big deal. And I think that's number one. And one of the things that happens now with the FDA and others who are doing these guidelines is they can get really crazy about the amount of detail they want in terms of your documentation when you're developing a survey. I keep sticking with surveys because that's what I do, but how did you get to the end survey? They want to see you started here, you ended up here, and they assume it's a linear process. Like, okay, we found this issue with this item, so we threw it out, this issue, so we revised it. And to a certain extent, you can do that. But I've been in projects where you have community advisors and technical experts, and it looks like you're going one way, and then all of a sudden some expert says, no, this is totally wrong. And you kind of jump all over the place, and it's really not a linear process. So it's sort of documentation and communication in that way that's very challenging, I think. So I just throw that out. But also, saturation is one example where I think we all want to say we have saturation, but it's kind of like to me, well, yeah, you showed it in your sample that you're not finding anything new, but what if you went out to another sample and it was different? Then maybe you would find something new. So it's kind of like an onus that you have to show that, but that yet it's a really problematic concept in some cases. I mean, in theory, it's useful, but that's all I want to say.
Mary, you want to go next, and then I'll go last on that, or?
I think the challenge that I feel that I've encountered is the expectation to do mixed methods, or like if somehow if you want to do a qualitative project, well, if you don't add any quantitative to it, then no one's going to take your project seriously. And I have felt that, like I've written proposals and it feels forced sometimes to have to say, I'm doing mixed methods. And I feel like I'm doing all this gymnastics, right, to contort myself, to show how I am doing surveys and doing it with interviews and, mixing everything up. And I just find that to be so, it feels a little dishonest, right? Yes, I will be doing that, right? But no, that was not my original intention. And but if that's what people want to hear. So I feel like these become buzzwords. I think we were talking about that with Gary a little earlier. Like these kind of become buzzwords, and then everyone expects you to do it, right? And they expect you to do it a certain way. Like this is what counts as mixed methods, or this is what counts as mixed methods analysis, right? And it almost becomes its own. It takes an life of its own, right? And suddenly it's just being lorded over everyone. So I feel that way with mixed methods. Like it's just like everyone just gets hammered over the head with you have to do mixed methods, or and yes, there's a time and a place for everything, right? But I feel that somehow mixed methods is supposed to supersede all other methods and approaches, and that just drives me up a wall.
So I would like jump in here. What I hear is it's almost like you have to pay homage to the methodological gods.
Yes.
Right? and it's like, oh, really? At this day and age, come on, do we really have to do that? And it is zealot-like.
Yeah.
It's sort of like it's a religion. And it's like, just be pragmatic, please.
Okay, no, great examples of some of the challenges that we face. And it's good to share them, right? So that we validate ourselves. So, it makes us feel better that we all encountering these challenges in our work. I think, I'm going to share one myself, and then when working with the students, I think for me, myself, as an economist, I have encountered really difficult sometimes to publish my qualitative research. I think people like to pick on it a lot. I feel like because they say, well, it's subjective, and I tend to reach more general audiences who might not be as familiar with qualitative research, right? So I feel that for me, that has been a challenge. I have to be very persistent. I have to get feedback. I recall giving Gary my paper a couple of times, like, it's been rejected 3 times. You have any idea how I can, have the right words for the reviewers to feel a little better about my paper, right? So I think for me, I mean, I love the work and I'll keep doing it and I'll keep being persistent, right? And I think with students, and here I also want to hear from the experts, I work with the students, to develop a capstone when they graduate from the Masters in Public Policy at Pepperdine. And their interest is very diverse, right, in many areas. But just giving an example, there were my students, when they start thinking, they want to talk to experts, right, in the field. And then their discussion questions start, tell me everything you think is important about US-China relations. And then I was like, no, we need to spend more time. Or like, for example, I had some students who were very interested on, and again, I feel that it takes time and it takes me time myself too. I mean, I also find myself that my first discussion questions need to be refined. I mean, I don't think I'm just saying my students, I have done it myself too, right? But one example too, some of my students were very interested in studying the implications of Cancer Alley and the health and race and ethnicity disparities, right? And they will start with very general questions, right? And always my work with them is to sit down and say, let's work together, or I want you to revise these questions and really think, what is the information you want to gather? Because if you are too general, right, it's very difficult to really get something, right? I mean, Gary, you probably will agree on this, right? I mean, once in a while, just throwing in a question and see what is the feeling that people will throw in. That will be, something you might be interested on. But if you already have some hypothesis, right, of the, a specific thing you really want to learn more about it, you need to be specific. And it takes time to refine your discussion guide. And it really, the way, that's a challenge. I mean, I want to create a discussion guide that is really going to gather the information I need for my research. And sometimes I fail myself too, right? So I think that's a challenge. I want to say that that we really need to spend good time figuring out like what is the information we want to get from our participants, right? And how we can frame these questions in a way that is going to lead us to where we want to go and gather the information, right? So I always tell my students, the more specific you are, I feel that the more you're going to learn from this conversation. The more broad you are, then you're going to get lost. And, your experts, everyone is going to say something different. And then, it's very hard for you to really get a consensus or really understand the issue, right? So I think we can move into the next question. So what are some of the skills that you think are most useful conducting mixed methods research? And here we can say 1 or 2 skills and we can agree or disagree again. Who wants to jump in first?
I'm happy to jump in first on this one. I think the most useful skill for mixed methods research is learning how to ask for help. Like, you're not an expert in everything, right? So ask the quantitative expert to come in and give you feedback. Ask the qualitative person to come in and give you feedback. Ask the community advisory boards to come in and give you feedback on all the instruments that you're using. I just think it's important. I think for myself, I'm not a quantitative expert, not even close. So when I have to do mixed methods, it would be like folly for me to think that I'm going to do mixed methods research because I'm going to equally do, quantitative and qualitative. Like, no, I don't know enough of the quantitative, right? So I think it's important to be able to ask for help and ask people who know more than you do. And people who know more than you do in the field as well, because you might think, oh, I have the best qualitative questions, but maybe these things have been done or the field's moving in a different direction. So I think it's just important to know how to ask for help.
So mixed method team sport.
Yes. Team sport.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that totally. You can't be a jack of all trades unless you're, Superwoman, Superman. But it's important to get experience with it, so that you know what's going on. So you at least get your feet wet. So for example, of course, I spend a lot more time on quantitative type analyses or deductive type analyses and confirmatory. even exploratory. But I have led focus groups, and I did that in hepatitis C, at UCLA, and it was, I think I can do an okay job, but it's people who do it more are going to be better, and there are certain personalities that are better. If you're a good communicator, a good listener, those kind of things, and not everybody is. So you may not be very good, but if you can get a chance to practice that and even do cognitive interviews and, in-depth interviews, whatever it is that is important to your area, then at least you're going to have a better idea of what goes on. I think in general, though, you don't have time to do the whole thing anyway. So it's really nice if you've got the resources that you've got the real experts doing it. And even more so than what Romero just said, it's great to get advice from people that can help you. If that's all you get, that's great. But if you have the real experts doing the work with you collaborating, that's even the best case.
Yeah, I think I'll piggyback here, right? I think it's all about, learning from others and being open to ask for help. And I think I also had on my notes for today's conversation that the best way is to work with someone else who has expertise, right? And be fearless, right? I think for me at the beginning, I was like, how am I going to moderate a discussion? That really takes a lot of skill. And it does, right? But I think that once you participate on some studies, from other people. At least that's how I started. I first wanted to see an expert, Beverly Wainmer from RAND, right? So she helped me moderate some of my groups at the beginning. So I think that's a good way. And the skills, yeah, I feel like being open to learn new things and being organized. I feel qualitative research requires a lot of organization of like collecting the data, getting into transcription, getting it organized for the way that you're going to analyze it. And I mean, we can talk more about that later. And we have some resource links in these slides that we can talk about later on, the different approaches to analyze qualitative data. But yeah, I'll keep it brief so that I know maybe we can talk briefly about the last question and then we can open it.
Can I just say one thing that I want to get, because I don't think Gary said too much, but my sense for like just examples, a focus group moderator, a good focus group moderator has to understand who they're working with or be someone that could be friends with the people they're working with. Because a lot of times people say, like if you have a bilingual focus group moderator, that's great with Spanish speakers. It's obvious that you couldn't have just an English language person, but even by race, let's say you're interviewing, which we've done in CAPS, African American women only for some subgroup. And then you say, well, does it have to be an African American moderator? Well, that's usually great because there's going to be some connection, but it doesn't mean that it has to be if the focus group moderator really relates. Like you could see, they could be friends with the people. They're not so distant that they don't even understand what they're doing. You have to have a connection. So I think that's important in my mind. I don't know what Gary or others think.
Yeah, well, I was going to pick up on what all you said but when you say, I am going to do mixed methods, your role is an organizer of the research project at that point. You're not doing everything. You're organizing, making sense of it. You're the one that's guiding the questions. The asking of experts is, help me with all the things that are going to have to be done here. How am I going to design the exploratory? That means how do I collect? How do I analyze? On the same thing on the quantitative side. So you become, in mixed method, an organizer of research, not a technician of a methodologist, right? The more general you are, and I think that's really important, is being general is I kind of get what all the pieces are, but enough to have the conversation across the players on your team. And that's critical. So you got to have a breadth and you got to be able to communicate because sometimes you are the translator between different players in your team. All right. And so I think those are real important skill sets. But mixed method is organizing first and foremost. And you're just being strategic. I mean, generals in militaries are organizers of all the moving parts to accomplish the goals. That's what you're doing here.
Okay, so we want to open up for questions. So it is 4:02 and we want to open up for questions for the last 10 minutes at least. So we had a last question. What are the opportunities for funding for mixed methods research? So we can discuss briefly if the panelists can share like a couple of things. I know we have some slides. I looked for some things today and I put some links there. But I'll let the panelists jump in quickly to share, and then we can open up for questions.
So I'll just say that I don't, once in a while there's a specific RFA on that, so you could look for that. But I just think that anything you do, almost it's beneficial to do mixed methods research. So that's why I'd answer it. It's like any funding opportunity almost, unless you just want to focus on one thing or the other and it works out. It's just pretty universal. So I don't know that there are that many opportunities to do specifically, like methodological development of mixed methods, but there's certainly some opportunities of that type. And I know, like you said, you've got some links there at the end.
Okay, thank you. Omer or Gary, you want to share something?
I second what Ron said.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's pretty diverse at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share that, as the NIH, we're familiar that is very interested in mixed methods approach, right? When we are submitting proposals, I'll mention that for this presentation, I just did a quick search, and apparently there is a foundation that apparently funds some consultation for qualitative research. So I added a link to that to the slides that we're going to share. And then I'm just going to share my experience with economists. I have a grant from the Social Security Administration, and in the last call, they really want to see mixed methods. And it was very interesting because it's kind of like a new thing there, So, but I feel that, and again, for me, it was like, yeah. Anyway, so I want to share that I feel that nowadays, most of the federal funded grants, right? They are like, okay, we want to be community-based now. We want to learn more from the community. We want to make sure they use mixed methods. So we have to make sure we take both approaches. Right. So, but okay, so we can jump into questions.
Let me just follow up on that. I think one of the issues here is you see mixed methods used in funding proposals because it's about where you want to go. And it really opens up and asks it wants you to ask more sophisticated or a set of questions. So it's in proposals. But when you actually come to publish, you can't publish mixed methods in a journal article because there's not enough room. Yeah. So what we end up saying is I took a mixed method approach and this paper is going to talk about this piece of it because that's how it works. Now, occasionally in Ron's case, like for surveys, you're going to bundle in your method section. I did this section in order to get to the survey, but it's going to be literally super short paragraphs to set up that you checked all the right boxes and people will head bob. But you can't publish a mixed method of here's my survey results and here are my interview results. You don't have enough room. It doesn't work that way in the publication side. This is primarily a proposal space. That's what I see it as.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Gary. Yeah, I feel like that's an important point. It's very hard to publish, so you always have to break it down in several papers. Okay, I think this is a good time. So yeah, they put some links in the chat, and then we're gonna share these slides too. Yeah, some of the links here are what we had in the slides, and so we can jump into questions with the group. So please, I will say raise your hand or just jump in. We can have like 10 minutes for questions. We had some links of like a specific, techniques for data analysis and software and things like that you can check out, or training opportunities, right? I'm all about learning online these days, right? So I found some interesting learning opportunities. So any questions? This is a good time to jump in.
This has first been just very helpful. I think one of the main takeaways was multiple of you have talked about being the organizer of research in mixed methods because it can get overwhelming. So I came from another institution a couple years ago where I worked closely with a qualitative statistician. And so kind of had a heavy crutch. She's like, okay, she knows what she's doing. And so now it's like, okay, how much do I invest? And then you get all of the resources and you have, as junior faculty, only so much time, I'm sure less time as you become more senior. And it's like, where and how much do you invest in the education time? And so I see all of those resources up there, which I'm going to go through. So thank you so much. But have any of you had kind of personal experiences with any of them, like one over or another, or one that you really want to highlight, that you think for someone who's, mixed clinical research, and does a lot of mixed methods, but doesn't have that formal training? Which ones would you highlight, if any?
I mean, I'll jump in quickly. The radar technique, that's the one that I found very useful. I think Sylvia and Ron were the ones who kind of like, we started putting that in a proposal. And then I use it with my students a lot because it's cheap, it's quick, right? And again, qualitative research, I mean, that's another challenge. It takes so much time, right? Yeah. So the radar technique, I would really recommend for like, if you have to do a research qualitative sort of approach with low resources and quick turnaround. That's something I have really liked. And then I'll mention the University of Michigan training are really good. So I haven't done the qualitative one specifically. I have done the HRS training. So that I will definitely pay attention to some of that training. It is worth it. I don't know if other of the panelists want to bring attention to a specific. And then I really like DDoS. DDoS was something I used in the last qualitative project. And I thought it was, the learning curve was pretty easy. So those will be my highlights. Homero, Ron, Gary?
So I think it's going to vary depending on the person, but what you said is what I would get. I'd look for even the VA. The VA has great health services research webinars, and sometimes it'll be on focus groups or it'll be on, observational studies or whatever. And if you're not intending to do that, and you don't need to look at it. But the good thing about these short things that you can get in a little introduction, and you could then decide, do I need to spend more time learning, and you get resources just like you get here. So it's really going to vary a lot. I wouldn't say one thing, but like you just said, Lisa, software, that's important in some cases, and it's not necessarily the specific software, but a lot of times it can be very helpful. If you're not going to use it, I guess it doesn't matter. But if you are, like UCLA has done some classes, in vivo and that kind of thing. And if you want to try that out, to me, the benefit of that was you really think hard about the data. It isn't the software per se, but what you have to do when you use it to code things makes it a lot more clear what it is that's going on in the data set.
Okay, so any other answers on your highlights on some resources, Gary and Homero? And then I know Helen has a question.
I'll just say quickly that in terms of resources, but study what you like. You don't have to be an expert in everything. So I'm more partial to qualitative myself. So if I had to take courses, I would probably just spend more time there to refine my skills. But yeah, I wouldn't stress about having them both people. I mean, some people are that brilliant and that's great. I'm not. So I just, focus more on one than the other. So what you like, it'll be your time. So and energy.
Gary, any highlight on resources or training or?
I think unless you're going to get trained as you want to be a methodologist, you're not going to be strong on both sides. In some ways, methods are sort of like wine tasting. You need to know enough to use the right words to sort of know there's a difference between whites and reds and rosés, and that's that level of importance of seeing those videos just to expose you to the tools, because if you're aware of them, they change your questions. Tools change what we ask. It's not necessarily, here's my question, what tool do I use? So getting familiar with a broad sense, just lightly familiar, actually is really useful for putting together these packages. That's what I would invest in. If you're going to go explore, get narrow on your topic area and get good at least one technique, so you feel like you have an expertise there, but then get broad on a bunch of things is what I would recommend, especially early in your career, because you never know what you're going to use as things evolve over 30 or 40 years.
Thank you. And Helen, what is your question?
Hi, thank you for a great session, by the way. I love all the metaphors too. They make so much sense. But I have a question that I think I've actually addressed with a couple of you already. In today's digital world, there's a lot more qualitative data collection that's happening virtually. So, I mean, I think certain types of data collection are probably easier to transfer to virtual, like for example, an interview. But I know that some people have at RCMAR too have been doing focus groups online as well. And, just keeping in mind all the challenges to doing focus groups in person, I feel like they might be even heightened on the virtual setting. So I kind of wanted to see what people's experiences have been with that.
Thanks, great question. I think I'm gonna defer that to Homero, right? Since
Yeah,
Homero
that's
has a session
Homero.
on that, so we'll let Homero take that one. But I agree, it's such a good tool to be able to do focus groups in Zoom these days.
So yeah, I have had a chance to do a few focus groups online, and I think it's important to allow yourself to be directive or even heavy-handed. Because I know some people say, oh, if we do it online, people want to, turn their cameras off, or then this happens and that happens. And I feel like you don't have to tippy toe so much around participants. I would say, I'm going to be respectful, but I've always said, please keep your camera on. For example, you have to, I think it's important to reflect back what you hear. As even in this Zoom session, when people start talking at the same time, like someone gets cut off, the microphone doesn't pick everyone up, right? So it's important to just very intentionally just pause, ask people to restate, or you summarize what you heard, and then you keep going, right? So just quick adjustments. In person, it wouldn't matter because we all hear each other even when we interrupt each other, not in Zoom, right? So I think those things are important, but I think the most important thing is like, don't be afraid to just give people directions and tell them what you need them to do to participate so that we can have a successful focus group. I think that's one of the biggest things. Like, don't be afraid of participants.
I would recommend you actually do face-to-face focus group moderation first, because the level of expertise is way higher because of all the things that Homero is talking about. I mean, you still set the ground rules in face-to-face, but just practice face-to-face before you get into virtual. It's super complicated.
I agree 100%. I have done lots of face-to-face focus groups before I transitioned to online. I did not start doing online focus groups. I started face-to-face focus groups and then transitioned to online. So I guess I just tweaked some things, but it's possible.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to go from phone interview or face-to-face to phone to virtual interviews, semi-structured interviews. That progression is not that hard, especially if you're familiar in just in your work environment with working in that virtual space. It's pretty easy. But yeah, the focus groups is, you better have a good, you want to have a good reason why to do the focus group. Is what I always recommend.
Well, thanks. I feel like we're in the mark, 4:15. I think, it's been a good conversation. We had some good questions. The slides will be available. If people have other pressing questions, I know we didn't have tons of time for questions or discussion. Please reach out, right? I mean, we're open to continue this conversation. I think there's going to be another qualitative method seminar at some point, right? So I'm sure we'll get to discuss further.
Yeah,
but,
it's correct. Yeah, please finish up.
Yeah, so we can wrap up, right? And I think what is very important, for RCMAR CHIME is that you please complete our survey, right, on this seminar, right? So that we can get your feedback, and thank you so much for your participation, and looking forward to more conversations like these in the coming weeks. I don't know anything else that I'm missing, Christina. Thank you to our panelists. It was great.
Yeah, we can flash the flyer of our schedule of upcoming.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so here we have another qualitative data analysis session coming up in December, right? So that will be also, and then, the virtual quality method. So definitely more opportunities to keep elaborating on this work and learning more. So, okay, so I think we can wrap it up, right? To be mindful of everyone's time. And thanks everyone for being at the seminar. And I think for the next work in progress session, we stay here, right, Christina? For those who
stay at this.
Right.
And then
I just put.
Oh yeah, the link to the survey.
I will post the link to the survey. Please do that. We really appreciate your feedback. It helps us develop the topics that needs to be discussed. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
You see, Louisa.
Let's step up to the
Sure. For our works in progress section, we'll just take 5 minutes for bathroom breaks.
Okay.
And then Jennifer will come on.